One of my colleagues on social media posted, right now we're in a strange situation of blending together the 1918 influenza pandemic, the 1929 onset of the Great Depression, and the protests of the mid-1960s, while we're being governed by someone who's like President Andrew Johnson.
I'm with Thomas Sugrue, New York University, kind of expert on urban issues and race and politics and history. And I think your book, Origins of the Urban Crisis, kind of the textbook of Detroit of modern times. Thanks for talking to me today.
It's great to be here.
Now, we're talking about what's going on right now. We saw your tweet about 1968 compared to 2020. A lot of things point back to Detroit in modern history, but what do you think's going on here comparing that time to this time? I think we'd all been kind of shy away from that idea, but maybe it's time to talk about this.
Yeah, well, there are some important commonalities and some significant differences between Detroit or American cities in the long, hot summers of the mid-1960s and today. Maybe I'll begin with some of the commonalities. Almost every urban uprising or rebellion or riot, they were variously called that at the time and subsequently, almost every major urban uprising in the 1960s was sparked by confrontations between the police and African Americans. And that has certainly been the case with what's been happening in the last several days here and around the United States. So that's a commonality. Another commonality, in the 1960s, many of the uprisings were accompanied by peaceful protests, by demonstrations. So the line between protest and folks taking to the streets and engaging in more conflictual behavior is a pretty blurry one in the 1960s, and it definitely seems to be a pretty blurry one today. Some big differences. The crowds are a lot more diverse in the cities where I've seen footage and have been following in the media. 1960s uprisings had some white looters and participants, but most of the folks involved in the uprisings were African American, and most of the uprisings were centered in African American business districts and neighborhoods. And that's definitely not the case today, where you see racially mixed crowds of demonstrators and neighborhoods being targeted in the cities that have experienced looting and arson, property being attacked in downtowns, in shopping malls, in places where whites both own and often shop.
We really have a more diverse population now than we did then. I think back then we really didn't see a kind of black and white, Latino, Asian, that sort of thing was not as so much in the mix back then.
Yes and no. In the 1960s, commercial areas and shopping in particular were pretty strictly segregated even in the North. You wouldn't find very many African American shoppers in suburban shopping malls, for example. And today, of course, you'll see African Americans and Latinos and Asians and whites often sharing some of the same commercial spaces. That's a change. But when it comes to residential and educational segregation, African Americans in particular and Latinos in many parts of the country are still very highly racially segregated. And so blacks and whites and other groups might be shopping together and appearing in some of the same common places, but they're often going home, going to school, and socializing in worlds that are still pretty racially divided.
Are you seeing those groups, though, Latinos, maybe even Asians, as I mentioned, finding more solidarity with the African Americans today?
It really depends on the place and on the issue. I think there have been, in the 60s too, there were important moments of interracial solidarity, and today there are as well. It's hard to know. Some observers of what's been happening in the U.S. in the last days, in the aftermath of the Floyd or during the Floyd protests, have noted that there are the color of the the groups protesting changes over time or changes depending on specific place. Some have suggested, for example, that the crowds breaking windows are whiter or less African American than the crowds protesting police brutality. Again, we don't have enough information to make any clear, definitive statements about that yet. But what is for sure is that you see black and white faces and Latino and Asian faces in some places together in ways that were unimaginable in the uprisings of the 1960s.
But we do see a lot more maybe white folks in there this time. I guess, is it generational too? Younger people involved? I don't know if that happened back in the 60s. A lot of white kids from the suburbs coming down to take part of, say, even the peaceful protests like there were. Maybe it more had to do with the war than the racial issues.
Yeah, I think it depended on from case to case, but overall, by the mid and late 1960s, most of the protests were dominated by African Americans, civil rights protests, that is, and Black Power protests, of course. And I think we do see a change. I'm drawing from anecdotal evidence from watching videos of what's happening in different cities, but I've noticed the crowds at the big protests where you have speakers, the more formal and organized protests, tend to be pretty diverse age-wise, race-wise. The looting and vandalism crowds tend to be younger. And again, I think one would have noticed that in the 1960s as well. But certainly many of the whites who I've seen in the face-offs with police in places as diverse as Minneapolis, Philadelphia, New York, many of them are young. It's a young crowd.
And then, but we have something totally different this time with this pandemic. I don't know if there's any way to really compare in some ways with that as a factor.
Yeah, I mean, one of my colleagues on social media posted, right now, we're in a strange situation of blending together the 1918 influenza pandemic, the 1929 onset of the Great Depression, and the protests of the mid-1960s, while we're being governed by someone who's like President Andrew Johnson. So we're in a very different moment in some fundamental ways from 1968, just in the fact that all of these different and unusual it's an unusual combination of challenges that we're facing simultaneously right now.
I guess when you bring Andrew Johnson, and that might be a little bit more obscure reference to some people, but the whole idea with, our current president, how does he react into this thing compared to Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, you know?
Well, Lyndon Johnson faced real challenges by the election of 1968 because of challenges to his legitimacy, especially around the Vietnam War. Many criticized Johnson for not keeping a lid on the protests and the violence that appeared on the streets in the United States in the mid-1960s. But Johnson tried and tried again to talk about coming together, about unity, about common cause and common purpose, even in some of the bleakest moments of the 1960s, maybe especially so, right? After the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, after the assassination earlier of Martin Luther King Jr. But Trump, on the other hand, seems to be taking fuel from the fact that there are ongoing intense conflicts in the streets and seems to be goading people on, while simultaneously kind of hiding out. And he hasn't gone out and met with protesters. He hasn't made a national address to the American public the way that Johnson frequently did in moments of crisis, and met most other presidents. He's kind of ducked and covered and tweeted and thrown little tweet bombs out into the streets rather than exhibiting the kind of call to unity that is often the rhetoric of the presidency.
Well, I think we remembered Nixon a lot for the Watergate problem, but if we think a little deeper, it was the war on crime that came out of his administration. And is there any kind of connection to that and what we've got going on and maybe our near future with this election?
Yeah, the war on crime had really wide bipartisan support in the 1960s, and some of the key initiatives came out of Johnson and were extended and made more punitive during the Nixon years in the 1970s. But Nixon made the call to law and order and the promise to restore calm in America central to his campaign. And that way, he's really different from Trump, right? Trump calls for law and order, but he hasn't talked about calm. Now, Nixon, of course, did very little to really facilitate that calming. 69 and 70 saw some of the biggest protests and a lot of disruption in the United States on campuses. Kent State was 1970. And so Nixon had a difficult time keeping a lid on things as well, but he certainly capitalized on the fears that disruption and social movements had planted in the heads of Americans, in the heads, especially of white Americans in the mid-1960s.
And we also see Trump referring to Antifa a lot being behind some of this. And when I think back to what's going on with a lot of at least some of the people that are participating, it puts me in the mind of Occupy or what was going on in Seattle a couple decades ago. The WTO protests and all that sort of thing. Is that a dynamic in all of this?
I think we have to see today's protests as a coming together or a fusion of these different currents. They look like the 68 protests, but they're also influenced by the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999, Occupy Wall Street, Ferguson in 2014, Baltimore in 2015, the protests around police brutality in Charleston. I think these are all coming together in a different configuration than we saw in the movements of the 1960s.
I know this is really unfair to ask, but I think I've been watching a lot of this stuff, at least locally a lot, and a little bit of Minneapolis that we can watch live on our computers now. Where do you think this is going to play in our history?
2020 is going to go down, I think, just on the basis of what's happened this year so far. COVID, a massive economic collapse, and now major uprisings in the streets. It's going to go down as one of a handful of really decisive years in American history, along with 1968, along with 1929, along with 1877, a year of great strikes and unrest. I think there's no doubt, even barring an analysis of the election that's going to happen in November, there's no doubt that this is going to go down as one of the most decisive years in recent American history.
Professor Sugrue, thanks for talking to me today.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to be here.
Thank you.
You can find more at onedetroitpbs.org or subscribe to our social media channels and sign up for our One Detroit newsletter.